Hello and welcome to Curator's Perspective Guerrilla Girls, hosted by the National Museum of Women in the Arts. I'm Gabby Owuma, the Senior Membership Manager at NMWA. Thank you for joining us for this special virtual presentation by Assistant Curator Hannah Shambroom. Tonight, you'll hear from Hannah as she discusses the exhibition Guerrilla Girls Making Trouble, currently on view through September 28th. This exhibition was organized by the National Museum of Women in the Arts and generously supported by the members of NMWA. Thank you all to the members and supporters of NMWA in attendance. We couldn't champion women in the arts without your support and dedication to the museum. And now, before we begin, I encourage you to use the Q&A feature to share your questions for our speaker, Hannah. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible before the event concludes at 7. Now it's my pleasure to turn this program over to Hannah.
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, I'm excited to share with you all. Let me pull up my little presentation here. So I'm going to share a little bit about one of our current spring-summer exhibitions, Guerrilla Girls Making Trouble. The exhibition opened on April 12th and it will be on view through September 28th. So still have plenty of time to see it if you haven't had a chance to come into the museum yet. I'm going to give a little bit of background on the Guerrilla Girls. We'll take a look at some specific works with some installation images sprinkled in there. And then I can give some insight as well as to what the process is for working with this group of anonymous artists. But let me know in the chat if you've been able to see the exhibition in person or if you have plans to coming up. Again, still got a couple of months, so lots of time. Some of you might be familiar with the Guerrilla Girls already, or at least recognize them. They're a pretty recognizable force, I would say, in the art world. But they're a group of anonymous feminist activist artists who are most known for their provocative street campaigns, the witty wordplay in their text-based work, and their advertising style graphics in prints and posters that denounce discrimination in the arts and beyond. As you can see in this photo, members of the group wear gorilla masks in public to protect their identities, and they take on the pseudonyms of well-known deceased women artists such as Frida Kahlo and Kate Kolwitz. Guerrilla Girls works have been shown at NMWA many times in smaller selections like you can see here in our collection galleries, as well as in solo exhibitions and features in other group exhibitions. These two images are shown from one of our reopening exhibitions, Holding Ground, which mainly featured artist books, but included a selection of 4 Guerrilla Girls prints alongside them. The last time we had a large-scale solo exhibition of Guerrilla Girls work was in 2011, as you can probably see from our very dated carpet and gallery space here. Luckily, the museum has had a few upgrades since then, but this exhibition was Guerrilla Girls Talk Back. Longtime members might have seen that exhibition as well, but it showed at the time every Guerrilla Girls work in NMWA's collection at that time. The current exhibition, Guerrilla Girls Making Trouble, is a more focused exhibition on the museum's 4th floor, our new 4th floor gallery space. And again, it's pulled entirely from NMWA's extensive holdings of Guerrilla Girls works. It features about 40 works, the earliest of which is from 1985, so one of the very first works they created, to newer works that were created just in the past couple of years. And this more focused exhibition really focuses on the group's roots and their distinctive style, which, as you can see from this, kind of single installation shot, relies heavily on text. One motivation for organizing the exhibition is that 2025 marks the group's 40th anniversary year. They formed in 1985, and they formed actually in the wake of an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York called An International Survey of Painting and Sculpture, which claimed to present the best artists working at the time. And the curator of that exhibition had remarked to the press that any artist not included in the exhibition should rethink his career. And of the over 160 artists that were included in the exhibition, fewer than 10% were women, and even fewer than that were artists of color. Um, the artists that came to form the Guerrilla Girls were not the only people that felt rankled by this. There were certainly protests and some picketing that was happening around the museum and, kind of in protest of the exhibition. But the artists that would eventually become the Guerrilla Girls noticed that those protests just really weren't effective. Visitors were walking straight past and right on into the museum, and it wasn't being covered really as much in the press as they would have liked. And so a small group of artists decided that more unconventional techniques would be needed to capture larger public attention to this issue. So on a spring night in 1985, they snuck through the streets of Lower Manhattan, which is an area that's home to many of the city's most prestigious galleries and arts institutions and museums. And they wheat pasted these posters on walls, on signposts, street lamps, phone booths that denounced gender discrimination in the arts and specifically called out and named the institutions and individuals that were participating in that. And the group came to call themselves the Guerrilla Girls due to their guerrilla style activism tactics. It started as a group of about 7 members, but over the years they've had over 50 members come and go. Sometimes members will join for just a meeting or two, some for many years. Some of the original founding members are still part of the group now. But their identities remain anonymous, and that's both to protect themselves because many of them are working artists in their own right, and then also to maintain focus on the issues that they're advocating for and creating work about rather than individual personalities or individual members' works. And the gorilla masks allegedly came about from a sort of funny typo made by one member of the group. The person who was taking notes at that meeting apparently was not a very good speller. And so when they were talking about their, guerrilla tactics and calling themselves the Guerrilla Girls, she had mistyped that in their notes as the animal gorilla. And so that kind of came to be a symbol for them. It's also, of course, a practical solution to hiding their identities. But in their work, they've also noted that having these gorilla masks and kind of taking on these personas also emboldens them to be more outspoken in their work. A common refrain that you see them saying in press interviews or on their website or in text is that you'd be surprised what comes out of your mouth when you're wearing a gorilla mask. These are two of their earliest posters, a couple of the ones that they were putting up in 1985. What do these galleries have, or sorry, what do these artists have in common? And these galleries show no more than 10% women artists or none at all. Very early on, you'll see that they focused their attention specifically on the New York City art world. So they were calling out galleries, critics, and even other artists who they felt were complicit in the unequal treatment and representation of women artists and non-white artists. The work on the left, you can see names about 20 galleries that disproportionately represented men. And the work on the right actually lists 42 prominent artists who were mostly white men who allowed their work to be shown in spaces that weren't equally representing women artists. While sexism in the arts was really kind of at the center of their original slate of posters, other early works from the 1980s focused on racism in the arts as well. And they were, from a very early stage, drawing attention to the unequal representation of non-white artists in these same institutions. These works are pointing out that gallery representation, fair pay, exhibition opportunities, the same things that were being encountered by women artists were doubly hard for non-white artists to access. And you'll notice from the 4 works that I've shown here that these very early works really kind of eschew any graphics and really just focus on bold black and white text that are reminiscent of newsprint or news headlines. It's these kind of concise, bold, eye-catching statements that are then backed up by statistics. And this emphasis on language and facts rather than more perhaps traditional elements that we normally think of with art, like color, form, line, was very innovative, but it was also very practical because it delivered their message in a very clear and concise way. There was really nothing to focus on in these prints aside from the statements that they were making. And alongside these prints that they, kind of snuck out and put up in the street, they released a press statement that said, "Simple facts will be spelled out, obvious conclusions can be drawn." So in these early works, they aren't even really doing very much interpretation, we could say. They're really just kind of spelling out stark facts, and they're displaying them in this very bold, clear, eye-catching way. The exhibition at NMWA showcases the works of the group's evolution of style in their work over the years from 1985 to 2024. And you can see, as later works come up, that they eventually begin to include more color and imagery into their prints. This is one of their best known works, "Do Women Have to Be Naked to Get into the Met Museum?" You can see that it borrows a nude female figure from the Ankh painting Le Grand Odalisque, and it replaces her head with that of a gorilla mask, similar to the ones that the group uses. And it's paired with statistics that outline the ratio of works by women versus works of women in the modern art section of the Met. And you'll notice if you look at the image caption here, this one includes the word update in the title, and it's from 2005. Um, this speaks to the group's practice of updating or revisiting certain subjects or certain statistics in their work. And this was a really important part of their practice over the years. They weren't necessarily focused singularly on one moment, calling it out and moving on. They were actually kind of tracking progress and tracking changes. And while they acknowledged when things did improve, they also were not afraid to call out the same institutions, the same individuals, and the same issues when things didn't change. So here you can see in the middle is the work that's on view at NMWA and NMWA's collection, the update from 2005. Above it is the original work from 1989. And then below is a slightly more recent update from 2012. And you can look between these three works and see that the statistics are not much improved, and in some ways actually got a little bit worse. So I think this is sort of an interesting part of the way that they work, that they recognize that these issues aren't going away, and they're kind of keeping on them and keeping track of them, and recognizing when more progress is needed. While the Guerrilla Girls, as I mentioned, initially really kind of tightly focused on New York City arts institutions, they've also branched out to other national and international cities over the years. These are some more recent projects. This one was installed in the UK. This one you can see was a project that they did for an institution in Germany. This is a big billboard-sized print that they installed in the exterior of a building in Spain. This was a project that they did for a museum in Bangkok. So they really kind of expanded their geographic focus. Later, I'll talk about how they expanded their subjects that they were dealing with. But this is just to say that pretty quickly they realized that this was not just an issue in New York City institutions, it was an issue around the country and really around the world as well. This is one of the works that's on view in the exhibition, and as you can see, it focuses on Washington, D.C. There's an image of the National Mall in the background, and over that is layered this sort of false tabloid style print. This was created in 2007, And it's a work that calls out the hypocrisy in DC area art museums. They specifically name the National Gallery of Art and then the Smithsonian as an institution. But it addresses the disproportionate presence of white male artists in these DC institutions, and it calls for change. And this was actually created as part of a special spread that was done by the Washington Post in 2007, highlighting art and feminism in NMWA's 20th anniversary year. So this was nearly 20 years ago, 18 years ago now. And you can see, the Guerrilla Girls occasionally will work with institutions or with organizations. Here, for this special spread for the Washington Post, they took on this tabloid style spread, again, kind of mimicking newsprint, which would have been appropriate, of course, for the Washington Post. And you can see there's this bright yellow headline. Well, first they've sort of mimicked OK magazine, which is like a celebrity, like tabloid kind of magazine, I think. And then you can see in bright yellow print, they've announced this headline, Horror on the National Mall, thousands of women locked in the basements of DC museums. And then they've included a graphic, which they've actually since reused in other posters as well, that shows women's bodies with artists' heads superimposed over them. You can see, I think there's Yaya Kusama, Frida Kahlo is in there, and they're locked behind a jail cell, sort of mimicking the fact that many DC area institutions, while they may have women artists in the collection, they're kept in storage and not displayed as often as some of the white male artists in their collections might be. On the right, I know the text is a little bit small, but one part of the headline says the National Gallery, boy crazy. And so it's also, even the language that they're using is sort of playing on the misogynistic way that women are treated by the media and written about in the media, only in relation to men. But they're sort of reappropriating that language to address the actual issue of sexism in the arts in DC, but also more broadly. And I really love this work, not only because NMWA is actually called out in it as an example of a museum that is showing women artists, but I also think that this is a really great example of the way that they use humor. They use this kind of witty, pithy language that makes these serious issues and the statistics that they're backing them up with feel more engaging and approachable. But I think it's also interesting, this work is from 2007. Stylistically, it's such a jump from the work that they were producing in the 80s that was really kind of just stark text, black and white. And so I think it's an interesting evolution seeing the way that they begin using photo collage and color to enhance their message, which, remains kind of steadfastly resolute in pushing for equality within the arts. This is another work that directly pokes at a DC institution. This work was made in 2018, kind of responding to the Me Too movement, and it addresses sexual harassment and abuse in the arts. Specifically, this work is centered on Chuck Close's portrait of Bill Clinton in the collection of, and currently, as far as I know, on view at the National Portrait Gallery. Um, some might know that in 2017, Chuck Close was accused of sexual harassment by several of his models. And then, of course, the subject of the painting, Bill Clinton, was involved in his own sexual misconduct incident as well while he was in office. And the print takes this very clever format of showing three ways of writing a museum wall label. And I think this one is interesting for museums because it deals with this, question that I think many people kind of come up against, which is what do you include in a museum wall label and how do you reconcile information about the artist versus information about the artwork? Um, in this print, they offer three increasingly explicit suggestions for how to write a wall label when the artist is a sexual predator. The first is the original label that the National Portrait Gallery had on the wall in the wake of the allegations. And you can see it says, Chuck Close is one of the most important artists of his generation and the creator of a new kind of portraiture consisting of patterns of color. And then the following two are suggestions from the Guerrilla Girls of what they think need to be added. So the second one pretty much, kind of keeps the original label, but with one sort of more damning sentence. So it says, Chuck Close is one of the most important artists of his generation and the creator of a new kind of portraiture consisting of patterns of color. Like many artists, he has had a few disgruntled employees. So again, they're sort of using this humor and sarcasm to, sort of underplay the severity of this issue, which reflects the way that, the original wall label really kind of failed to address it at all. And then the final one is the most explicit version. So it says Chuck Close has had a huge career with prices to match. He has been accused of sexually abusing models and students he picked up at fancy art schools. How fitting and ironic that he painted the official portrait of Bill Clinton. The art world tolerates abuse because it believes art is above it all and rules don't apply to genius white male artists. Wrong. And I think one thing that's sort of interesting about this work is that eventually the National Portrait Gallery did update the label on the artwork. I don't know if that was a direct result of the Guerrilla Girls calling them out, but in many instances, their very bold, aggressive tactics do result in change. And so now, in addition to information about the artwork and the artist's style, as well as biographical information about the subject, the label now states, the National Portrait Gallery acknowledges that in 2017, several women accused Chuck Close of sexual harassment, though no charges were brought against him. The museum recognizes the positive and negative impacts that individuals represented in our collections have had on history. So there was kind of a shift. Again, we can't directly point to the Guerrilla Girls for being the cause of that, but I think these types of work that they create really speaks to their dual roles as artists and as advocates and as activists. Again, sort of expanding their reach within the arts globally, this poster was created for and takes the subject of the Venice Biennale. And with this work and with Horror on the National Mall, we can see examples where the Guerrilla Girls partnered with other parties to make works commemorating specific events. So in this work, they were invited by one of the co-directors of the Venice Biennale in 2005, Rosa Martinez, to create an installation for one of the exhibitions, Always a Little Further. And the Venice Biennale is a renowned art fair that has existed since the late 19th century. And it's to be invited to exhibit there or to be part of a pavilion is definitely a career milestone for many artists. Unsurprisingly, it's definitely been dominated by white male artists historically. And so in 2005, the Biennale was sort of being touted as a sort of a feminist achievement because it had two women directors and there was more of a focus on women artists. So it was certainly fitting that the Guerrilla Girls were invited to participate. But, like much of their work, they weren't going to participate with also offering some criticism or a critical eye over the event. So you can see in this work, it addresses the lack of women artists displayed in Venice. These works you can see in the image on the right were displayed as these kind of monumental, like 16-foot tall pieces. In it, the Guerrilla Girls appear as picketers donning their signature masks. And in some ways, their little signs that they're holding celebrate the achievements of that year's Biennale. But the Guerrilla Girls are really not letting anyone rest on their laurels. They're also pointing out areas that still need improvement. So the sign all the way on the left says, French Pavilion has a solo show by a woman. And then the smaller print underneath says, who cares if it's the first time in 100 years? And then another one says 38% women artists in the curated group shows. The smaller print says, who cares that so many national pavilions are only showing men? And so I think this really sort of embodies the Guerrilla Girls spirit. They're acknowledging these areas of change. They're acknowledging areas of improvement towards better equality, but they also really want to keep pushing conversation forward. They're going to continue being provocative wherever they're invited to take up space, and they're not going to let these areas of progress, however good they might be, get in the way of pushing forward for better equality. And then shifting gears a little bit, pretty early on, the Guerrilla Girls also began addressing other political, social, and cultural topics outside of the arts. Their advocacy work in the arts has definitely been a driving force throughout all 40 years that they've existed. But they also really kind of became a force pushing for equality in other areas as well. So this work addresses the pay gap. It notes that women in America earn only two-thirds of what men do, and women artists earn only one-third of what male artists do. This is a work from 1985. Um, you know, as I'm sure many of us are aware, 40 years later, things are not that much better. Today, women earn overall around 83 cents to the dollar. So, of course, there is some improvement, but not 100% there yet. And in the arts, that disparity has actually only continued to grow. The highest price paid for a work of art by an artist who is a man was over $450 million, a work by Da Vinci. Um, versus for women artists, the highest paid for a work of art is $44 million for a work by Georgia O'Keeffe. And, of course, I acknowledge, and you could argue that, that type of market value isn't necessarily reflective of artistic value or quality, but it's a pretty clear marker of the way that women are continually undervalued, and that that type of financial inequality has real implications as well. Of course, the statistics are even worse for non-white artists, trans artists, non-binary artists. Um, but again, this is a topic that they were addressing in 1985 that continues to be front of mind, I think, for many people working today. And I think this work also sort of shows, especially early on, they're very clever and minimal use of graphics. This is a very simple graphic. It's a $1 bill with a dotted line at the two-thirds mark. But it really effectively underlines their point in a visual way. Um, and kind of again adds to this really eye-catching, almost headline-like style that they've adopted. One thing that I really wanted visitors to the exhibition to understand was that many of these issues that the Guerrilla Girls were focusing on in the 1980s and 1990s do feel very pressing today. Of course, the pay gap is one of them, but there were many other issues that they were really sort of in the forefront of calling widespread attention to. This work is called Missing in Action, and it describes topics that the Guerrilla Girls felt were of critical significance in the early 1990s. This work is from 1991. And some of those listed are homelessness, healthcare, education and childcare, the environment and energy policy. So I think it's a testament really to their being on the forefront of advocacy in areas beyond the arts as well. And also definitely a flag that, these are issues that are still kind of front of mind in the news daily. This is a work that was created in 1996 to encourage people to vote in the presidential election that year. Um, Based on the text, you can likely guess which side of the election the Guerrilla Girls were on. But I think it's interesting to share here and also to have on view in our galleries now, having just come out of an election year. Of course, as I'm sure many of you know, when we're planning exhibitions, we're doing it years in advance. So this exhibition was organized, long before this recent election. But I think it's interesting to display this work, like nearly 30 years later now. And you can see that many of the political topics that were clearly front of mind in the 1996 election are still ones that were debated more recently as well. You can see they've sort of cheekily listed what they see as the Republican prize, things that deal with immigration, reproductive rights, the minimum wage, and then the Guerrilla Girls Prize, which is sort of counter to that. So they're proposing an all-female Supreme Court, gay and gleeful marriage for all, people who won't vote relocated to DC. I'm not sure how people who live in DC would feel about that, but that's part of the Guerrilla Girls vision for the future in 1996. And I bring this up because the Guerrilla Girls describe themselves as feminist activist artists. And so that activism point is really as important to them as their role as artists. And in terms of their activism, they really put their actions where their mouth is. You can see here, these are two works that deal with reproductive rights and abortion access. The work on the left, well, these are all posters, but the work on the left is an earlier work from the I think from 1990, and then the work on the right is a little bit later. The work on the right is actually, or the image on the right, the posters that they're holding are a series of four works that say, I decide, you decide, we decide, they don't decide. And they created and carried those at the 2017 Women's March in DC. The image on the left is from a rally in support of reproductive rights in 1992 that was also in Washington, D.C. So sort of full circle. Um, and I wanted to show these in part to show their activism, but also to illustrate how the Guerrilla Girls, both as a group and as individuals, really kind of embody the ethos of their artistic practice. So, these aren't just concepts that they're thinking about and creating prints about. They're really kind of on the ground advocating for them as well. And, continuing to use these kind of unconventional tactics to get their message out there, being on the ground and attending protests. Um, and then I think similarly, reflecting on their advocacy and activism with their work that deals more directly with museums and deals more directly with the arts, members of the group occupy this kind of delicate space where they are participants in the systems that they're critiquing. The individual members of their group are mostly artists. Some of them are writers, but they're working in the arts as individuals in their own right. And many of them have work as individuals in the collections of the very museums that they're calling out. Um, and similarly, as a group, they have, kind of entered the attention of museums enough that museums are collecting Guerrilla Girls work as well. So, they're participants in these institutions and systems that they are still kind of actively, you know, like on the ground protesting as well, which is sort of interesting. And that kind of leads actually to this last work that I want to share, which is called Guerrilla Girls Manifesta for Art Museums Everywhere. This is one of their most recent works. This is from 2024. And showing this installation image, actually, I'll kind of take an aside to share some insight about the process of organizing an exhibition. So there's a lot that goes into organizing an exhibition and putting it up on the wall beyond just selecting and researching artworks. A big part of it is also making decisions about how the works are displayed, as well as things like, paint color and text and all kinds of other little things. But I had this idea when I was organizing the exhibition to pay homage to the Guerrilla Girls' origins with street art. And so, early on, they were wheat pasting posters to buildings. They were creating billboards. They were creating bus ads. And, kind of part of their guerrilla tactics and practices has been creativity in scale and location and where their works are shown and how. So of course, a museum and gallery is the most traditional type of art space, but I was really interested in, paying some kind of homage to their roots. And um, I really wanted to show one of their works out large scale. So we were able to print this work manifesta as, not quite billboard sized, but it takes up an entire wall of the exhibition. And I really love how it turned out. I think it's, like the spirit of their work, it's really unignorable. And I also just want to mention, I think it worked so well. The opposing wall that you can see in this image here is actually part of the other exhibition on that floor. It's an exhibition of Women's Studio Workshop, which is another group of feminist artists. And so one of the graphics for that exhibition was this kind of like repeated poster decal. And so I felt very much in alignment with the spirit of the Guerrilla Girls with that. Um, and I guess also kind of a fun, like behind the scenes tidbit. So this work was acquired for the exhibition. It was one of four works that were acquired to be included in the exhibition. Again, this was the most recent, but normally when you acquire an artwork, you're just receiving a physical artwork. Of course, for the Guerrilla Girls, because they're producing posters, when a work is acquired for a museum, it's very high quality, museum quality print. So you receive a physical print. But, I think part of the Guerrilla Girls work is, this sort of spirit that art belongs to everybody. And so when one of their physical prints is purchased now, you also receive a extremely high resolution digital file. And so that enabled us to show this at large scale. But I just really, I was well, first of all, I was grateful that this idea I had to make something so big actually worked out. But I also really, I enjoyed kind of the Guerrilla Girls' encouragement to display their work in, what might be sort of like a less conventional way than just being framed and on a museum wall. So I felt that that was very appropriate. But one of the reasons I wanted to kind of end this little selection of works with this one is that I feel it really kind of comes full circle with many of their earliest works that are advocating for better equality within the arts. Um, while, as you can see, they continue to explore other pressing political, social, and cultural topics, the arts are still very much at the forefront of their work. And this one offers these, kind of cheeky suggestions to museums. Some of them, let's see, I can read some of them. One of them says, cast out institutional racism, sexism, classism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, and colonialism too. Another one says, get real. If a museum shows only super expensive art bought at super expensive galleries and donated by super rich collectors, it should rename itself the Museum of Super Rich People's Art. Another one says, write wall labels that tell the whole history of art, including but not limited to slavery and the genocide of indigenous peoples. So, they're very much, I would say, still in alignment with exactly what they set out to do in the early 1980s, which is to grab people's attention, to make them aware of these areas of inequity and inequality, and to do it in a way that's not only attention grabbing, but also approachable, still using these very bright colors, these sort of crazy graphics with a gorilla mask, and, the format of kind of speech bubbles there as well. Um, and I like this work especially because I think, um, with some of their earlier works that are really just strictly directly naming galleries, critics, individuals, um, those are very direct. And I think what the Guerrilla Girls are trying to do, not to sort of like put modern parlance on things that they were doing 40 years ago, but they weren't really trying to like cancel anyone or simply, shame any institution or any individual. Their work really comes from a place of wanting true improvement and to actually help individuals and institutions and museums and, anyone in a position of power to have more equitable and fair practices. And I think this work really embodies that. And also in this way, I think, the work of the Guerrilla Girls and the work of NMWA are really aligned. Like the two groups share a common mission of advocating for greater equality in the arts. And today I think many of these issues of gender and racial equality are given more attention than they have in the past. I'm sure we can all see that. But new generations of artists and, people working in institutions are continuing to face many of the same hurdles. So even 40 years out, on this 40th anniversary year for the Guerrilla Girls, there is really this continued and pressing need for their work and for their advocacy. Um, and I should mention too that NMWA is also approaching a 40th anniversary in 2027. So really the timeline of the Guerrilla Girls forming and kind of stepping into this, area of gender equality and advocacy work, the timeline of that definitely aligns with NMWA's timeline as well. And the museum and the group were aware of each other early on. We've worked with the Guerrilla Girls many times throughout the years, including for that 2011 exhibition that I mentioned, as well as programs. More recently, they participated in our In Focus video series. You might have seen that. That was in the Long Gallery right when you walked into the museum, but the videos produced for that project are available online as well. Um, but I think just with that alignment between Nimwa and the Guerrilla Girls, it just felt really fitting to have this exhibition in 2025. And it was definitely a joy for me to go through all of the works that are in Nimwa's collection and revisit them and kind of look at them through, a lens of it happening at this time and in this year. And then this is a horrible photo. I'm just noticing how blurry this is. But I also just wanted to mention, because I feel like this is a question that I get all the time of what it's like working with a group of anonymous artists. And I feel like this photo really it just shows it very well, I would say. First of all, I was also very grateful to the Guerrilla Girls that they allowed us to use these more than life-size images of them as graphics. It came out amazing, and I have to shout out Elizabeth Lynch, who is our director of publications, who did these graphics because they came out so amazing. But one of the members of the Guerrilla Girls, who you can see on the right of this photo, wearing the black shirt with the green stripe and gorilla mask, obviously that's the Guerrilla Girl. Um, that is Keta Kolwitz, who was one of the founding members of the group, and she's still kind of one of the main organizers and communicators. And I before I started, reaching out to them about the exhibition, I did not know what it would be like to work with them. Whoops, I don't know what happened to my image there. But it was kind of an interesting process because when you communicate with them, like you are communicating with their pseudonym. So when you reach out to email them, you're emailing Keta Kowitz, you're emailing Frida Kahlo, and that is just very much how they communicate. And then the image that I just showed was actually shortly after the exhibition was installed. Keta Kowitz was able to come on site and see it and, approve of everything. But I mean, from, the moment that she's in the door, she's wearing a gorilla mask. And so they're very much, kind of continuing to protect their anonymity. It's not just something that they do for public appearances. It's definitely kind of a entire persona that they take on, and that's how they communicate. Um, so I know we're kind of getting close to the end. I'll give it some time for questions as well. And I'm happy to pull up any of the slides if I don't know if it's useful to see any of the images again.
Thank you, Hannah. That presentation was so good. Your comment about the Guerrilla Girls describing themselves as feminist activist artists reminded me of Zanele Maholi's talk at the museum in May. And so it's so interesting to think about two artists that are in our collection and how they approach being activist artists in different ways and like what representation and calling attention to different um, ways that discrimination exists in their different in their lives and the lives of the many artists that are involved in Guerrilla Girls. So that was really, really awesome to hear. Great.
Yeah.
Cool. So we're gonna open the floor for Q&A. If you have a question that you would like Hannah to answer, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A feature. I'll also cross-check the chat to make sure we don't miss any questions there. But I will start with our first question. And so this member, they've shared like, I've seen the exhibition, and while I found the messages powerful and agree with most of them, I still wonder if this is art, and or if an example of using visual imagery to convey a perhaps controversial political feminist set of messages. So do you think that will last within the field? And then how do you think future art historians will interpret it? And I feel like it might be interesting to think about, I guess, with it being the 40th anniversary and like how they were viewed when they started versus now, or how we approach their work now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that's a fair question. And with the Guerrilla Girls especially, I think it's interesting because they, are producing, they're both producing works. Well, their origins, of course, were sort of outside of museums and institutions. And then, at a certain point, transitioned to being a group that was collected by museums. So they're producing these sort of museum quality prints. But they also sort of maintain this very populist approach to their work, and they sell, posters that you or I could buy, and I actually have some in my office, which I feel like a Guerrilla Girls super fan right now. But it is interesting because they're sort of towing this line between being, you know, part of the arts and outside of it, and critiquing the arts and existing outside of it. And then in terms of their style, they're, removing a lot of what we might traditionally think of as the things that are really important in a work of art. But they're certainly not the only artists to be doing that. And I think especially at the time when they formed in the 1980s and even before that, many artists were using text-based art that was sort of, with minimal graphics or even free of graphics entirely, in order to address, issues both within and without of the arts. So, artists like Barbara Kruger or Jenny Holzer were creating sort of stylistically, perhaps similar types of work. So, the Guerrilla Girls were certainly not alone in that. They were, one of the groups that were sort of at the forefront of it. But I think that at the time it was part of this sort of overall aesthetic shift, kind of coming out of pop art, even you can think of, which incorporated a lot of text too. They're kind of even making it more minimal than that. But definitely part of sort of an artistic and aesthetic trajectory within art history. And it is something that's already, that type of movement is already something that's being studied and thought about by art historians. If the question was more kind of about their role as activists, I think a lot of artists consider themselves activists. As Gabby mentioned, Zanele Mahole is a great example. They consider themselves an artist and an activist. So, um, yeah, I mean, I think, I've been interested in looking at the Guerrilla Girls work because it feels very current in terms of their themes, I guess, and topics, but stylistically, like I think it definitely fits within the time that they formed and definitely, at least to me, holds up now as well.
No, that's such a good point. And I think, art can exist in so many different ways. Like thinking about the question, is it art? And it's like, poster making or like even zines, and just thinking about um other communities and how they use activism, and how like the like ephemera and other things that come out of it like become art and become like the lasting things that come out of it. And thinking about like feminist art and how that has like changed and shifted and grown over the years, since that's become like I don't want to call it a style, but a way that we classify art. But yeah, thank you for answering that. Cool. So I have a few more questions, and I promise try to make sure we get out of here on time. And so I don't know if you know have the answer to this, but how many works have they made since they were founded, and what percentage is in the exhibition?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think, oh my gosh, I'm not even gonna attempt to give an exact answer, even though I literally was just looking at this. But I think it's close to 200. But that kind of also depends on how you look at it, because of course each work has been displayed in multiple ways. So, they've done in terms of just prints and posters, I think it's somewhere around like 180 or something close to that. Don't quote me exactly. Um, and yeah, there's about 40 in the exhibition, so I won't attempt to do mental math on that, but you're right that it is just a fraction. And yeah, the intention of the exhibition wasn't necessarily to um, even give like a broad overview. It was really mostly to sort of revisit some of their works through the lens of 2025. So that was why I chose to focus on the 40 works that I did. But, there's a million ways that you could really go with that. And NMWA has, I think, over 80 works in the collection. So, um, yeah, it was an interesting challenge whittling it down just to just to 40 or so.
A great group of 40 works. I might be biased, but it's a great group. Okay, and then another question we received. One of our attendees shared that one of the Guerrilla Girls, Frida Kahlo, is a great speaker. And I know we don't have anything on the schedule now, but like, would you want to bring in one of the Guerrilla Girls for a program or to speak with us at some point in the future?
I would love that, of course.
Yes.
Like obviously, I love the
Mhm.
crystals. I think they're great. I don't, yeah, as you said, Gabby, I don't think that there are currently any plans to do that, but suggestion noted, definitely. And yeah, as I mentioned, like we definitely have worked with the Guerrilla Girls on programs in the past, so they've come to speak at the museum before. And it'd be great to see them again.
Agreed, agreed. And there are some really great, you might have seen on our Instagram, the Guerrilla Girls were one of our gala honorees this year. And so there's a nice little video reel on our Instagram account and our social media accounts if you'd like to see them. Um, at the member that came to the gala at the museum on our social media accounts.
Yeah. And I should also add, actually, like along the lines of programming, that the Guerrilla Girls, of course, they do, talks, and they are, as this person commented, very engaging speakers, but they like host workshops as well with students. They do workshops focused on art making as well as focused on advocacy work and activism campaigns. Actually, they have some works themselves that they've produced that's come out of some of those workshops that they've done with students of all ages. So they're definitely getting out there, and they're doing it.
Great, love that. Cool. All right, and so we have 3 minutes left, so I am going to shift over to wrap things up. I think there are a few questions that I will be able to answer in my wrap up, but thank you again, Hannah. Okay. Right. Great. Okay. So thank you all again for joining us for Curator's Perspective Guerrilla Girls. I hope you visit us and see these works in person. And if you have already, please come back, bring a friend, share the power of women artists with everyone you know and love. We have some really great programs coming up in the coming months. So first up, please mark your calendar for Curator's Perspective, a Radical Alteration on Wednesday, July 23rd at 6 p.m. Eastern. The show that Hannah mentioned shares the fourth floor with Guerrilla Girls. It's going to be a really great virtual program, and so I hope you can join us. And then following that, we will have a member tour in person on Wednesday, August 13th during our free community day extended hours. Space is limited, so keep your eyes peeled for this to go live on the website. We'll be sure to include it in our August e-news. And then later this fall, we have our first major historical exhibition opening. It's going to be the first major historical exhibition that we've had since we reopened. It's women artists from Antwerp to Amsterdam, 1600 to 1750. Member Preview Day is on September 25th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And then the virtual program will be on Wednesday, November 12th, and that will be led by the exhibition curator, Jenny Trainer. And also this fall, Tawny Chapman, Sanctuaries of Truth, Dissolution of Lies opens on October 15th. Opening day will be in conjunction with NMWA. Tawny most likely will be in attendance and will be talking about the exhibition. So if you're going to be in the DMV area, I would highly recommend joining us for NMWA that evening. And then later on, to be scheduled, will be the virtual program for the exhibition. And also just want to give you all a quick snapshot of our other upcoming programs through July and early August. You can visit our website to get access to all of these events, register. The links are live and ready to go. And then also as a reminder, our virtual programs, our public programs such as Fresh Talks and Creatives Keynotes, they are on our YouTube channel. The last 3 virtual programs that we have will be, that we recently hosted, will be uploaded to YouTube in the coming weeks in July, where they are getting post-captioned and made to look very pretty so that they are easy to view. And so we'll be sure to share in e-news when those are live and ready for you all to view. All right, but that's it for me, and I guess that's it from Hannah. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope to see you at the museum very soon, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. All right, bye.
Thank you, Gabby.